Sometimes the best things in life come when you're at your lowest, when hope feels like a luxury you can't afford. Bennett was a single father barely scraping by, but when he saw that overgrown field for sale at just $100, something inside him whispered, this was his chance. Everyone told him he was throwing away money he didn't have. The land looked forgotten, just rolling grass and weeds bending in the wind. But to Bennett it was quiet and full of possibility. Every morning he walked it with his dog Scout, dreaming of what could grow there. One evening Scout started digging and barking near some tall grass. What Bennett found beneath changed everything. But this discovery was just the beginning of something far bigger than he ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bennett's alarm went off at 5:30, same as it had every morning for the past 3 years. The sound cut through the darkness of his small bedroom, pulling him from a sleep that never felt quite restful anymore. He reached over to silence it, his hand finding the clock by muscle memory alone. The house was quiet, too quiet, the way it had been since Margaret passed. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the worn curtains. His body ached in ways it never used to. 56 years old, and he felt every one of them in his joints, his back. The persistent tiredness that never quite lifted no matter how much sleep he managed to steal. The bathroom mirror showed him what he already knew. A man worn thin by circumstance. Grey had taken over most of his hair, and the lines around his eyes had deepened into permanent creases. He splashed cold water on his face and got dressed in the same work clothes he'd laid out the night before. Jeans, a flannel shirt, steel-toed boots for his shift at Brennan's Hardware. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the old percolator Margaret had insisted on keeping. The sound of it burbling on the stove was one of the few things that still felt like home. While it brewed, he opened the back door to let Scout out. The dog, a mixed breed with intelligent, brown eyes and a grey muzzle that matched Bennett's hair, stretched in the early morning light and trotted into the small yard. Bennett poured his coffee into a thermos and stood at the counter, looking at the pile of bills that never seemed to shrink. Medical debt from Margaret's final year sat in a folder he couldn't bear to open most days. The hospice care, the treatments that hadn't worked, the desperate final months when he'd have paid anything, done anything, if it meant one more day with her. 3 years gone, and the debt remained. He worked 2 jobs, mornings and afternoons at the hardware store, evenings cleaning offices downtown. The custodial work paid cash under the table, which helped, but it meant 12-hour days, and coming home so tired he could barely remember to feed himself. Scout barked at the door, ready to come back in. Bennett let him in and filled the dog's bowl with kibble, running his hand along Scout's back as the dog ate. Scout had been Margaret's dog originally, a rescue she'd brought home 7 years ago with that smile that made it impossible to say no. After she died, Scout had stayed close to Bennett, as if the dog understood they were both grieving the same loss. On the small table by the window sat Margaret's garden journal. Bennett picked it up sometimes, carefully turning the pages filled with her neat handwriting. She documented everything she planted in their small backyard garden, what grew well, what didn't, which plants liked being neighbors, the dates of first blooms and final harvests. Breast flowers marked certain pages, their colors faded but still recognizable. Lavender, black-eyed Susans, the roses she'd loved. The garden had died after she did. Bennett had tried to keep it going that first summer, but between work and grief, he'd let it go. Now it was just patchy grass and a few stubborn weeds. He couldn't bring himself to tend it without her. He closed the journal gently and set it back in its place. Time to leave for work. The hardware store opened at 7, and Chester Brennan expected his employees there 15 minutes early. Bennett didn't mind. Chester was fair, paid on time, and didn't ask questions about why Bennett sometimes dozed off during slow afternoon stretches. The work was simple, helping customers find what they needed, restocking shelves, mixing paint, cutting keys. It didn't require much beyond showing up and being useful. His co-workers were mostly younger, people passing through on their way to something else. They were polite but distant, and Bennett preferred it that way. Small talk felt exhausting, and explaining his situation, widower drowning in debt, working 2 jobs just to stay afloat, seemed like more vulnerability than he could afford. The one exception was Chester himself, a man in his early 60s who'd owned the store for 30 years. He had a kind face, weathered by time, and a practical wisdom that came from decades of listening to people's problems while selling them the tools to fix things. "Morning, Bennett," Chester said as Bennett clocked in. "You look tired." "I'm fine," Bennett said automatically. Chester gave him a look that suggested he didn't believe that, but wasn't going to push. "Let me know if you need anything." Bennett nodded and headed to the back to start unpacking a shipment of garden supplies. Spring was coming, which meant the seasonal rush would start soon. People wanting soil, seeds, fertilizer, tools to revive their yards after winter. He handled bags of potting mix and stacked seed packets, his mind drifting as his hands worked. That's when he saw it. A small flyer pinned to the employee bulletin board, half hidden behind notices about schedule changes and safety reminders. Land for sale, 5 acres as is, $100, or best offer. A phone number was printed at the bottom, and someone had written the address in pencil, Rural Route 12, just outside town limits, $100. For 5 acres of land. Bennett stared at the flyer, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was probably nothing, probably terrible land, unusable, which was why it was being sold for practically nothing. Nobody sold good land at that price, but something about it pulled at him. 5 acres, space, quiet, open sky. He took a photo of the flyer with his phone. That evening, after his hardware store shift ended and before his custodial work began, Bennett drove out to rural Route 12. The address led him down a gravel road that turned to dirt, past farmhouses with sagging barns and fields ready for spring planting. At the end of a narrow lane marked only by a rusted mailbox, he found it. The land stretched before him, overgrown with tall grass that swayed in the wind, patches of bare dirt, clusters of weeds that had taken over whatever might have grown there before. A barbed wire fence, half collapsed, marked the perimeter. Woods pressed close at the back edge, and the whole place had an air of abandonment, as if it had been forgotten by everyone who'd ever known it. Bennett got out of his truck, Scout jumping down after him. The dog immediately began exploring, nose to the ground, tail wagging with the joy of new territory. The wind moved through the grass, making it whisper. The sun was low, casting everything in soft gold light. Bennett walked slowly across the property, feeling the uneven ground beneath his boots, breathing in air that smelled like earth and growing things and possibility. It wasn't much. It might not be anything at all, but standing there, with the sky opening wide above him and Scout circling back to check on him with happy eyes, Bennett felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. The faint, fragile beginning of hope. He called the number on the flyer. The woman who answered the phone had a voice like old paper, thin and rustling. "You're calling about the field," she said. "It wasn't a question, yes, ma'am. The listing said 5 acres for $100? That's right. It's not much to look at, I'll warn you. Used up land, my husband would have said. But it's mine to sell, and I'd rather someone have it than let it sit empty another year." They arranged to meet the next afternoon. Her name was Cordelia Finch, and she lived in a small house just off Main Street. The kind of place that looked like it had been there forever, with lace curtains and a porch that needed new boards. Bennett knocked, and she opened the door almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting right there. Mrs. Finch was perhaps 75, small and bent slightly forward, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that were sharp despite the wrinkles surrounding them. "Come in," she said. "I've got the deed ready." Her living room was crowded with furniture that had outlived its fashion by decades. Floral prints, doilies, photographs in ornate frames covering every surface. She gestured for Bennett to sit and lowered herself into a chair with the careful movement of someone whose bones no longer cooperated the way they once did. "You saw the property?" She asked. I did. Yesterday evening. And you still want it? There was something in her voice, not quite disbelief but close to it. I do, Bennett said, surprised by his own certainty. Mrs. Finch studied him for a long moment. May I ask why? Most people take one look and drive away. Bennett wasn't sure how to explain it. How could he tell this stranger that the land had made him feel something other than tired for the first time in 3 years? That standing there in the tall grass had reminded him of Margaret's garden, of growing things, of a life that wasn't just about surviving from one paycheck to the next. It feels quiet, he said finally. Peaceful. Like it's waiting for something. Mrs. Finch's expression softened. That's a kind way to see it. My late husband's family owned that land since 1940. His grandmother Eleanor farmed it for 40 years. Vegetables, herbs, flowers. She had hands that could make anything grow. But after she passed in 1985, nobody wanted to work it. My husband kept paying the taxes on it, but we never did anything with it. When he died last year, I knew I couldn't keep it. The taxes aren't much, but at my age, what do I need with 5 acres I'll never use? She pulled out papers from a folder on the side table. The deed, transfer documents, everything official and prepared. $100, she said. And I'll tell you what I told the 2 other people who called. It's used up land. Whatever was good in that soil got taken out decades ago. Eleanor's garden died with her. You can't expect much from it? I understand, Bennett said. Do you? Mrs. Finch leaned forward slightly. Because you look like a man who doesn't have $100 to waste. And that's what this probably is, a waste. Bennett thought about the bills on his kitchen counter, about the medical debt that would take years to pay off, about the sensible, practical choice that would be to walk away right now. But he thought about the wind in the grass, about Scout's joy exploring new territory, about how small and closed in his life had become. Maybe, he said, but I'd like to try anyway. Mrs. Finch watched him for another moment, then nodded slowly. All right then. Let me get a pen. The transaction took less than 15 minutes. Bennett signed the papers, counted out 5 $20 bills, money he'd been saving for a new pair of work boots, and received the deed in return. Mrs. Finch insisted on making a copy for herself, shuffling to a small office nook where an old copy machine hummed and clicked. There's one more thing, she said when she returned, handing him his copy of the deed. Eleanor's garden was in the southwest section, near where the old fence line meets the tree line. You'll probably still see some signs of it if you look close. She had it laid out real specific. She was particular about things like that. Bennett folded the deed carefully. Thank you for telling me. Don't thank me. I'm probably helping you make a mistake. But her eyes were sad rather than unkind. Still, if anyone should have it, better it's someone who sees possibility instead of just weeds. Bennett left with the deed in his jacket pocket and a feeling in his chest that was equal parts excitement and terror. He'd just bought 5 acres of land he couldn't afford, that he had no experience working, that everyone insisted was worthless. His brother Paul would have called him insane. Paul, with his engineering degree and suburban house and retirement account, who'd stopped calling after Margaret's funeral because he didn't know what to say, and apparently never figured it out. Paul, who told Bennett to move on 6 months after burying the woman he'd loved for 23 years. Bennett hadn't spoken to his brother in over 2 years, and he wasn't about to call him now to announce he'd just made what might be the most impractical decision of his life. Instead, he drove back to the property, his property now, and walked it again with Scout. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, promising spring's arrival. He tried to see what Eleanor Finch had seen when she'd worked this land. Tried to imagine rows of vegetables, herbs, flowers. Tried to picture himself as someone who knew what to do with 5 acres of forgotten field. He found the southwest section Mrs. Finch had mentioned. The grass grew differently there, in patterns that might have once been deliberate. He knelt down, running his hands through it, and felt something solid beneath the growth. A stone maybe, or an old tool. Scout sniffed around nearby, our tail wagging, and began to dig. "Hey, quit that," Bennett said. But without much force, the dog ignored him. Paws working enthusiastically at the soil, Bennett stood and walked over, intending to pull Scout away before he made a mess. But what he saw in the shallow hole the dog had created made him freeze. Green, living green, pushing up through the disturbed earth. A plant, growing wild, untended, but unmistakably alive and purposeful. Bennett dropped to his knees and carefully cleared more soil away. A tomato plant, small but healthy, its leaves spreading toward the sun. And next to it, almost hidden beneath the tall grass, another. And another. His hands began to shake as he pulled back more of the overgrowth. There was a garden here. Forgotten, abandoned, choked with weeds and wild grass, but alive. Still alive after all these years. Bennett spent the next 2 weeks thinking about the garden. Or rather, he spent every spare moment he wasn't working thinking about those tomato plants growing wild beneath the weeds. He'd go to the property after his hardware store shift, before heading downtown for custodial work, and walk the perimeter, trying to understand what he'd found. The discovery had shaken something loose inside him. During slow hours at Brennan's hardware, he'd find himself staring at seed packets, at gardening tools, at bags of soil amendment. Chester had noticed, had even asked if Bennett was planning to do some planting. Bennett had mumbled something non-committal, not ready to explain, that he'd bought land. He couldn't afford to chase a feeling he didn't entirely understand. On a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after finding the tomato plants, Bennett arrived at the property just as the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon. The light was golden and thick, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was. Scout bounded out of the truck ahead of him, already knowing the routine, already heading toward what they'd both started thinking of as the spot. Bennett followed, his boots crushing the tall grass, his breath coming easier out here than it did anywhere else. The air smelled like earth and the first hints of growing things, that particular scent of spring asserting itself after winter's dormancy. Scout had already reached the southwest section and was sniffing around the area they'd disturbed before. Bennett had been careful not to dig too much during his previous visits, afraid of damaging whatever might be growing beneath. But today, Scout's behavior was different, more insistent, more excited. The dog's tail wagged furiously as he pawed at a spot about 10 feet from where they'd found the tomatoes. "What have you got there, boy?" Bennett asked, kneeling beside the dog. Scout barked once, sharp and definite, then continued digging. Bennett gently moved the dog aside and began clearing the grass himself, his hands working through the tangled roots and dense growth. His fingers hit something solid, not a rock, too regular, too deliberately shaped. He worked around it carefully, pulling away handfuls of grass and loosened soil. A stone marker emerged, roughly square, about a foot across. Carved into its weathered surface were initials, EF and MF, and beneath them a date, 1947, Eleanor Finch, Mrs. Cordelia's husband's grandmother. The woman who'd farmed this land for 40 years. Bennett sat back on his heels, staring at the marker. 78 years ago, someone had placed this stone here, had carved their initials and marked the spot where something important began. A boundary marker, maybe, or something more personal, a memorial to the garden's establishment, to the work that would follow. He looked around with new eyes. If the marker was here, deliberately placed, then the garden wasn't random. It had been planned, designed, cared for. These wild tomato plants weren't accidents. They were survivors. Bennett stood and began walking the area systematically, pulling back sections of tall grass, looking for patterns beneath the chaos. Scout helped, moving from spot to spot with unerring instinct, as if the dog could sense where to look. It took an hour, but slowly the shape of it emerged. Rows, actual rows, still visible if you knew what to look for. The grass grew differently in lines that stretched roughly east to west. And in those lines, pushing up through decades of neglect, were plants. Squash vines, tangled with weeds, but still recognizable by their broad leaves and yellow flowers starting to form. Beanstalks that had climbed whatever supports they could find, now wrapped around grass stems and small branches. Herbs, rosemary, he thought, and maybe sage, growing in a section that must have been their designated bed. potato plants with their distinctive foliage, onions that had reseeded themselves year after year, wild raspberry canes creating an impenetrable thicket at the northern edge, an entire garden, abandoned and overgrown, but alive. Still producing, still trying to be what it had been created to be. Bennett felt something crack open in his chest, a sensation so sharp and sudden it was almost painful. This was what Margaret would have loved. This was what her garden journal documented. The patience of plants, the way life persisted even when left untended, the stubborn optimism of seeds that kept trying to grow. He pulled out his phone and took photographs, documenting what he'd found. Then he just stood there as the sun continued its descent, watching the light play across the wild garden. Feeling tears he didn't entirely understand sliding down his face. Scout leaned against his leg, offering the comfort of simple presence. "She made something that lasted," Bennett said quietly, speaking to the dog, to the garden, to nobody. 40 years she worked this land, and 38 years after she died, it's still here, still growing. The realization settled over him with the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just 5 acres of forgotten field. This was legacy. This was someone's life work, abandoned but not dead, waiting for someone to see it, to recognize it, to give it another chance. He thought about his own life, the medical bills, the 2 jobs, the exhaustion that defined his days. He thought about Margaret's garden dying because he couldn't tend it, couldn't face it without her. He thought about how small his world had become, how much of himself he'd let go dormant along with everything else. What if he didn't let this die too? The question arrived fully formed, as if it had been waiting for him to be ready to ask it. What if he cleared this land, tended these plants, tried to bring this garden back to what it had been? He didn't know the first thing about farming. He had no time, no money, no real plan. But he had Eleanor's garden still fighting to exist. And he had himself, worn and tired and grieving, but still here, still capable of trying. The decision felt inevitable, as if he'd made it the moment Scout had first started digging, and everything since had just been the world waiting for him to catch up. He'd bring this garden back to life. Somehow he'd figure out how. Scout barked once, as if in agreement, then trotted off to explore another section. Bennett followed, his mind already spinning with questions he'd need to answer, problems he'd need to solve. But beneath the practical concerns was something else, something that felt almost forgotten: purpose. For the first time in 3 years, he had something to work toward that wasn't just survival. He had something that felt like hope taking root. Bennett began the work on a Saturday morning. The first day in weeks he didn't have to be at either job. He arrived at the property with Scout just after dawn, when the air was still cool and the dew made everything shine silver in the early light. He'd brought tools from home: a spade, a pair of work gloves that had belonged to Margaret, a rusty hand rake he'd found in his garage. Not much, but enough to start. He'd decided to begin with a small section, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and see what he could uncover. Learn as he went, figure it out 1 square at a time. The physical work was harder than he'd anticipated. His body, accustomed to stocking shelves and pushing a mop, protested the sustained bending and pulling. His back ached within the first hour. His hands, even through the gloves, began to blister. But there was something deeply satisfying about it too, the tangible progress, the way you could see the difference your effort made. He worked methodically, pulling up handfuls of tall grass, separating the weeds from what might be useful plants, loosening the compacted soil. Scout stayed nearby, occasionally digging his own holes, but mostly just keeping Bennett company in that way dogs do, their presence a comfort without demanding anything in return. By mid-morning, Bennett had cleared enough to reveal the first real row: tomato plants, 6 of them, each about 2 feet tall and surprisingly healthy, despite the competition from weeds. He'd read somewhere that tomatoes could reseed themselves if the conditions were right, dropping fruit that would sprout the following season. These had apparently been doing that for years. Generation after generation of volunteer plants maintaining their presence in the space Eleanor Finch had designated for them. He was examining one of the plants, noting the small green tomatoes already forming, when a voice startled him. "You're wasting your time." Bennett turned to find a man standing at the property line, on the other side of what remained of the barbed wire fence. He was perhaps 65, weathered and lean, with a face that suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors. His arms were crossed, his expression skeptical. "Excuse me?" Bennett said. "That land. You're wasting your time trying to work it. It's used up, dead. Nothing good's going to come from it." Bennett stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. "And you are?" "Arthur Brennan. I farm the property next to yours." He gestured vaguely toward the east, where Bennett could see fields laid out in neat rows, ready for spring planting. "Been farming that land for 37 years. I knew Eleanor Finch, knew this garden when it was something. But that was a long time ago. Soil's exhausted. You'd be better off just letting it be." There was something in Arthur's tone that wasn't quite hostility, more like the weariness of someone who'd seen too many people fail to have much faith in their success. "I appreciate the advice," Bennett said carefully, "but I'd like to try anyway." Arthur shook his head. "It's your time to waste, I suppose. Just don't expect miracles. Land doesn't give what it doesn't have." He turned to leave, then paused. "You know anything about farming?" "No," Bennett admitted. "Figures." Arthur walked away without another word, leaving Bennett standing in his partially cleared section. Feeling both defensive and uncertain, Scout whined softly, sensing Bennett's change in mood. "It's all right, boy," Bennett said. Though he wasn't entirely sure it was, he returned to work, but Arthur's words stayed with him. Used up land, dead, nothing good's going to come from it. Maybe the man was right. Maybe this was foolish. A grieving widower with no experience, trying to resurrect something that had been abandoned for good reason. But as Bennett pulled away more grass, his hands encountered something in the soil. He dug carefully around it, working it loose. A hand trowel emerged, old and rusted, but still recognizable, its wooden handle weathered to gray. He brushed the dirt away, testing its weight in his palm. Someone had used this tool, probably Eleanor herself. Had worked this same soil, planted these same rows, tended this garden day after day, year after year. The trowel had been lost or left behind, buried beneath decades of growth, waiting. Bennett cleaned it against his jeans, ran his thumb along the blade. Despite the rust, the edge was still there. It could still be used. He spent the rest of the morning using Eleanor's trowel to work the soil. And somehow that made the labor feel different, less like fighting against something, and more like joining a conversation that had been happening long before he arrived. By afternoon, he'd cleared 3 rows completely, uncovering not just tomatoes, but squash plants beginning to vine, and what looked like potato stalks pushing up through the loosened earth. The section looked ragged still, chaotic, but there was order beginning to emerge, evidence of intention beneath the neglect. Bennett sat on the tailgate of his truck, drinking water from a thermos, surveying his progress. His body hurt everywhere. His hands throbbed. Tomorrow he'd barely be able to move, but he'd done something. Made a start. Proved it was possible, at least in a small way. He thought about Arthur's skepticism, about Mrs. Finch's warnings, about every practical reason this was a terrible idea. Then he thought about the trowel in his hand, about Eleanor Finch working this land into her 80s, about plants that kept trying to grow even when no one was watching. Maybe the land was used up. Maybe nothing good would come from this. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving here. And maybe he was the person who needed to try, whether it made sense or not. Scout jumped onto the tailgate beside him, panting happily, tongue lolling. The dog's fur was full of burrs and dirt, evidence of a day well spent. "What do you think, Scout?" Bennett asked. "Are we crazy?" Scout's tail thumped against the truck bed, which Bennett chose to interpret as encouragement. He looked back at the cleared section, at the wild garden beginning to reveal itself. 3 rows. It wasn't much, but it was more than there had been yesterday. Tomorrow he'd do 3 more, and then 3 more after that. 1 row at a time, 1 day at a time, until either he understood what he'd found or he proved Arthur right. But today he'd found Eleanor's trowel, and cleared 3 rows and felt something other than tired. Today was enough. 3 weeks into clearing the garden, Bennett made his most significant discovery yet. He'd been working a section near the stone marker, carefully removing layers of compacted grass and soil, when his trowel hit something solid and hollow-sounding. Not stone this time, wood. He cleared the area around it carefully, Scout watching with interest from a few feet away. A box emerged, small, roughly the size of a shoebox, made of cedar that had weathered but held its integrity. The lid was fitted tight, sealed with what looked like wax around the edges. Bennett's hands shook slightly as he worked it free from the earth. This was deliberate. Someone had buried this here, had taken care to protect it, had wanted it to survive. He sat back on the ground, the box in his lap, suddenly afraid to open it. What if it was nothing? What if it was everything? What if whatever was inside changed his understanding of what he was doing here? Scout whined softly, sensing the moment's weight. Bennett pried the lid up carefully. The wax seal cracked and fell away in pieces. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal tin, vintage, decorated with faded flowers. He unwrapped it and opened the lid. Seeds! Dozens of packets of seeds, each one carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Heirloom tomatoes, 1982. Yellow squash, Eleanor's best, 1979. Kentucky wonder beans, 1980. Each packet was dated, each one marked with notes about the variety, about what made it special, about how to plant and tend it. Beneath the seed packets were photographs. Their colors faded, but images still clear. Eleanor Finch, standing in this garden, probably in the 1970s, based on her clothes and the style of the photograph. The garden in full bloom behind her, rows of vegetables neat and abundant, her smile proud and genuine. More photographs showed the garden through seasons, spring planting, summer abundance, fall harvest, and at the bottom of the box, a small notebook. Bennett opened it with reverent care. Eleanor's handwriting filled the pages. Observations about the soil, notes about what grew well together, sketches of the garden layout, showing where each crop should be planted. The last entry was dated April 1985. "If you found this," it read, "then you found my garden too. I'm old now, and my hands don't work like they used to. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to tend this place. But these seeds, these are special. Some of them have been in my family for 3 generations. Some I collected from friends who are gone now. Each one represents years of careful saving, of choosing the best plants, of preserving what's good and true. If you're reading this, please don't let them disappear. Plant them. Save seeds from what grows. Pass them forward. Gardens are how we speak to the future. They're how we say that life continues, that there's always another season, that hope is worth the work. Thank you for finding this. Thank you for being here. Eleanor Finch." Bennett read the words 3 times, his vision blurring with tears he didn't try to stop. This woman he'd never met had left him a message across nearly 40 years, had trusted that someone would find this, would care, would continue what she'd started. He carefully packed everything back into the box and stood, cradling it against his chest. He needed to show someone this, needed to share what he'd found. The Millfield Public Library was a small brick building on Main Street, the kind of place that had been there so long nobody remembered when it was built. Bennett had been going there evenings after discovering the garden, checking out books on vegetable farming, on soil restoration, on heirloom seeds. The librarian had noticed. Her name was Constance DeWitt, a woman in her late 60s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a manner that was both brisk and kind. When Bennett walked in carrying the cedar box, she looked up from her desk with immediate interest. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "you found something. How did you know? You have that look." "May I see?" He set the box on her desk and opened it, showing her the contents. Constance gasped softly when she saw the seed tin, and when she read Eleanor's note, tears formed in her eyes. "I knew her," Constance said quietly. "Eleanor Finch. She used to bring vegetables here every summer, leave them on the front desk for anyone who needed them. She never made a fuss about it, just showed up with a basket and said she'd grown too much. If the town ate from her garden at one time or another, Mrs. Cordelia Finch told me Eleanor farmed alone, Bennett said. That she was a widow. She was. Lost her husband in the war, World War II. They'd only been married 3 years. She never remarried, poured everything into that garden instead. It wasn't just about growing food for her. It was about legacy, about preservation. She used to say that seeds were memories made physical, that every time you planted one, you were honoring everyone who'd saved it before you. Constance carefully picked up one of the seed packets, holding it up to the light. These are treasures. Some of these varieties, I'd bet they don't exist anywhere else anymore. She was doing important work, even if nobody recognized it at the time. What should I do with them? Bennett asked. Constance looked at him seriously. Plant them. That's what she wanted. But be careful. Learn how to save seeds properly so you can keep them going. These aren't just plants, Mr. Bennett. They're living history. Bennett left the library with the box, with Eleanor's note folded carefully in his shirt pocket, with a sense of responsibility that was both overwhelming and clarifying. This wasn't just about clearing a field anymore. This wasn't just about having something to work toward. He was a steward now, a keeper of something that mattered beyond himself. That evening, he returned to the property and stood at the stone marker, looking out over what he'd cleared so far. Maybe a quarter of the garden was visible now, the rest still hidden beneath years of growth. But he could see it now, could imagine what it had been, what it could be again. Scout sat beside him as the sun set, painting everything gold and amber. We're going to need help, Bennett said aloud. I don't know how to do this right, but we're going to figure it out. The next morning, Bennett did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He called in sick to work, both jobs. He couldn't remember the last time he'd taken a day off, for any reason other than being too exhausted to stand. But today he needed time, needed to think, to plan, to begin understanding the magnitude of what he'd found. He spread Eleanor's photographs across his kitchen table, along with her notebook and the seed packets, studied the layout she'd drawn, compared it to what he'd uncovered so far. The garden had been even larger than he'd realized. At least half an acre, maybe more, all carefully designed according to principles he was just beginning to understand. Companion planting, she'd called it. Putting certain crops together because they helped each other grow. Rotating crops year to year to keep the soil healthy. Saving seeds from the strongest plants. Building up the earth rather than depleting it. Bennett opened Margaret's garden journal, laying it beside Eleanor's notebook. 2 women, separated by decades, both documenting the same patient work of helping things grow, both believing it mattered, both leaving behind evidence of care. He made a decision then. He'd plant Eleanor's seeds, following her instructions as best he could. He'd learn properly how to save seeds, how to continue what she'd started. And he'd do it in a way that honored both Eleanor's legacy and Margaret's love of growing things. It wouldn't be easy. He still had no money, no experience, no guarantee of success. But he had Eleanor's seeds, her notes, her faith that someone would care enough to try. That would have to be enough. 6 weeks after buying the property, Bennett stood in what was now recognizably a garden. Spring had arrived fully, warming the soil, coaxing everything toward growth. The seeds he'd planted from Eleanor's tin were beginning to sprout, neat rows of green pushing up through the dark earth, each one a small miracle of persistence and faith. He'd cleared nearly half the garden now, working every spare moment he could find. His body had adjusted to the labor, grown stronger. The blisters on his hands had become calluses. He'd learned to pace himself, to work steadily rather than frantically, to trust that consistent effort would accumulate into progress. The wild tomato plants were thriving, and the beans he'd planted had already begun climbing the simple trellises he'd constructed from branches and twine. Squash plants spread their broad leaves in the sections Eleanor's diagram had designated for them. Potato plants stood in proud rows, their foliage thick and healthy, but the work had costs he hadn't fully anticipated. The garden supplies, even bought sparingly, even cobbled together from whatever he could find cheap or free, added up. Seed starting mix, compost, basic tools to replace the ones that broke, string for trellises, stakes for the tomatoes. Every dollar spent was a dollar he didn't have, stretched from paychecks that barely covered rent, and bills as it was, and he was exhausted. The kind of tired that went deeper than muscle and bone, that made thinking difficult and patience thin. Between the hardware store, the evening custodial work, and the hours at the garden, he was sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, usually less. Chester had noticed. "You're going to run yourself into the ground," he'd said just yesterday, concern evident in his weathered face. "Whatever you're doing after work, it's too much." Bennett had nodded, promised to slow down, and then gone straight to the garden after his shift ended. He couldn't slow down. If he stopped, if he let momentum falter, he was afraid he'd realize how impossible this all was, and give up. So he kept moving forward, kept working, kept planting and weeding and learning, even as his body begged for rest. Arthur had started coming by more regularly, though he maintained his skeptical demeanor. He'd stand at the fence line, arms crossed, watching Bennett work. Sometimes he'd offer a comment, "You're planting those too close together," or "Tomatoes need more support than that." But mostly he just observed in silence. Today, though, Arthur actually crossed onto the property, walking the rows Bennett had cleared, examining the plants with a practiced eye. "You followed her layout," Arthur said. "Not quite a question. I found her diagram," Bennett replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "In a box she'd buried." Arthur nodded slowly. "She always was particular about design. Said there was a right way and a wrong way, and the plants knew the difference." He knelt beside a row of beans, testing the soil with his fingers. "You've amended this soil." "Compost? Kitchen scraps, grass clippings, whatever I could gather. I've been reading about it. It shows." Arthur stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "You're doing better than I expected. Still think you're taking on more than one man can handle. But you're doing it better than I'd figured." Coming from Arthur, it was practically effusive praise. "I had help," Bennett said, gesturing to Scout, who was napping in a shady spot near the fence. Arthur almost smiled. "Dogs know more about farming than most people think." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something, then said, "I've got some old tools in my barn. Stuff I don't use anymore but is still good. Who cultivator better rake than that thing you're using? You can have them if you want." Bennett stared at him. "You're serious?" "Wouldn't offer if I wasn't. No sense in good tools sitting unused when somebody needs them." Arthur's expression softened slightly. "Eleanor would have wanted someone working this land, even if I thought it was foolish at first. I can see you're serious about it. That matters." "Thank you," Bennett said, genuinely moved. "I'll take good care of them." "I know you will." Arthur turned to leave, then paused. "You ever need advice? About the farming part, I mean, you can ask. I don't promise to be cheerful about it, but I'll tell you what I know." After Arthur left, Bennett stood in the middle of his garden, looking at what he'd accomplished. The transformation was visible now. Chaos becoming order, abandonment becoming intention. Visitors had started coming by, older residents who remembered Eleanor, who'd heard about someone restoring her garden. They'd share stories, offer encouragement, sometimes bring things, a bag of compost, seedlings from their own gardens, advice about dealing with particular pests. Constance from the library had started visiting weekly, bringing soup or sandwiches and staying to help weed. She'd appointed herself the unofficial documentarian of the project, taking photographs of the progress, collecting stories about Eleanor from people who'd known her. "You're creating something important," she'd told him last week. "This garden is becoming a community project, whether you intended it to or not. People need this, need to see something being restored, something beautiful coming back to life." Bennett hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been focused on the plants, on honoring Eleanor's legacy, on having something that gave his life purpose. But Constance was right. The garden was becoming more than just his project. It was becoming a gathering place, a shared mission, proof that abandoned things could be revived if someone cared enough to try. That evening, he stayed later than usual, working by the fading light to finish weeding a section of carrots. His back ached. His hands were sore despite the calluses, and he had her shift cleaning offices in less than 2 hours. But the carrots needed attention, and the work felt too important to postpone. He was so focused that he didn't hear the person approaching until they spoke. "This is remarkable." Bennett turned to find an older man, standing at the edge of the garden, perhaps 75, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried himself with the slight stoop of age, but radiated a quiet vitality. "Thank you," Bennett said, standing slowly. "Can I help you?" "I'm Vernon Whitlock. I was a friend of Eleanor's, knew her for over 40 years. Someone at the library told me what you're doing here, and I had to see it for myself." Vernon's eyes swept across the garden, taking in the neat rows, the thriving plants, the evidence of devoted care. "I never thought I'd see this place alive again." "Eleanor would be so pleased. You knew her well?" Bennett asked. "As well as anyone, I suppose." "We used to trade seeds, talk about gardening, compare notes on what worked and what didn't. She taught me most of what I know about saving heirloom varieties." Vernon's voice grew thick with emotion. "After she died, I tried to maintain her garden for a while, but I had my own land to work, and eventually I just couldn't keep up with both. It's one of my greatest regrets, letting this place go." "You did what you could," Bennett said gently. Vernon shook his head. "I gave up too easy." "But you haven't. That takes something special." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 3 small notebooks. "These are Eleanor's recipe books, for cooking, for preserving, for using what the garden produced. I've been keeping them all these years. Couldn't bear to throw them away." "I think she'd want you to have them." Bennett accepted the notebooks with trembling hands. More pieces of Eleanor's life, more evidence of her careful attention to every aspect of what she'd created. "There's something else," Vernon said. "I'm pretty handy with building things. If you need help constructing proper supports, a decent irrigation system, anything like that, I've got time and materials I'm not using. Consider it a gift to Eleanor's memory." Bennett felt something tighten in his chest. "I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering." Vernon smiled. "Besides, I'm old and bored. You'd be doing me a favor." As Vernon left, promising to return the following weekend with supplies, Bennett sat on the ground among the carrots and let himself feel the full weight of what was happening. He'd started this alone, thinking it was just him and Scout against the neglect of decades. But somehow, without meaning to, he'd sparked something larger. A community rallying around a garden, around a memory, around the simple idea that good things deserve to be preserved. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the opposite of the loneliness that had defined his life since Margaret died. It felt like belonging. Dickie. Call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Bennett was restocking paint supplies at the hardware store. His manager, a man named Pete Garrison, who ran the evening custodial service, asked if they could talk after Bennett's shift at Brennan's. Bennett knew immediately it wasn't good news. They met in the small office Pete used at the building where Bennett cleaned. Pete was perhaps 50, perpetually tired-looking. Someone who'd probably taken the management job because he needed it, not because he wanted it. "I'm going to have to let you go," Pete said without preamble. "You've been a good worker, Bennett, but you fell asleep twice last week. Once in the lobby where the building manager saw you." "I can't have that." Bennett felt the words land like physical blows. "It won't happen again. I'll be more careful. You said that last month. Look, I understand you're working hard, probably too hard, but I've got a business to run. I need people who can stay awake." Pete's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I'll pay you through the end of the week, but after that, I need to find someone else." Bennett walked to his truck in a daze. The custodial job had been bringing in nearly $800 a month, cash he desperately needed for rent, for food, for the mounting bills that never seemed to shrink. Losing it meant losing what little financial stability he had. He sat in the truck's cab, hands on the steering wheel, trying to think through the panic. He could look for another evening job, but who would hire someone pushing 60 with no specialized skills? He could ask Chester for more hours, but the hardware store barely had enough work for the hours he already logged. He could what? What could he actually do? The garden flashed through his mind. All those hours, all that work, all those seeds planted and tended and coaxed toward growth. What had he been thinking? That vegetables would somehow pay his rent? That Eleanor's legacy would keep him housed and fed? He'd been foolish. Arthur had been right from the start. Used up land, dead land. Nothing good would come from it. And now Bennett was going to lose everything because he'd chased something that was never going to be more than a beautiful waste of time. Scout whined from the passenger seat, sensing Bennett's distress. "I don't know what to do, boy," Bennett said quietly. "I really don't." He drove to the garden anyway because he couldn't think of anywhere else to go, parked at the edge of the field and sat on the tailgate, staring at what he'd created. The rows stretched before him, green and growing, evidence of months of work. Beautiful, productive, completely impractical. Arthur found him there 20 minutes later, pulled up in his own truck and walked over without asking permission. "You look like hell," Arthur said bluntly. "Lost my evening job. Fell asleep too many times." Bennett's voice was flat, defeated. Arthur was quiet for a moment, then said, "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know. Find another job, I guess. If I can." Bennett gestured toward the garden. "Maybe let this go. It was a nice idea while it lasted. That's your solution." "Give up? What else should I do, Arthur? I can't eat tomatoes for rent. I can't pay medical bills with squash." Arthur sat beside him on the tailgate, the truck creaking under their combined weight. "You remember what I said when you started? That this land was dead, that nothing good would come from it?" "I remember. I was wrong." Arthur's voice was gruff but sincere. "You've done something here that I didn't think was possible. You brought this garden back from nothing. That takes something most people don't have. Takes something I can't afford," Bennett corrected bitterly. "Maybe, or maybe you just need help." Arthur stood, brushed off his jeans. "Tomorrow morning, come to my place, early. We're going to work this garden together. The heavy stuff you've been doing alone. I'll handle the big clearing, the tilling, the infrastructure. You focus on the planting and tending. We split it up, we can get twice as much done in half the time." Bennett stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because Eleanor never turned down help when it was offered. Too proud for your own good. That's your problem." Arthur's expression softened slightly. "And because I've been farming alone since my wife died 15 years ago. Gets lonely. Might be nice to have a project with someone else for a change. I can't pay you. Did I ask for payment? I'm offering to help, not hiring myself out. Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Don't make me come looking for you." Arthur drove away before Bennett could argue further, leaving him sitting on the tailgate with Scout, feeling something shift in his chest, a crack in the despair, a small opening where light might enter. The next morning, Bennett showed up at Arthur's farm at precisely 6. Arthur was already waiting with his truck loaded with tools. A proper tiller, post-hole diggers, heavy-duty rakes and hose, coils of irrigation line. "We're going to do this right," Arthur announced. "Eleanor's garden deserves better than makeshift. And if you're going to kill yourself working this land, at least make it count." They worked together through the morning, Arthur showing Bennett how to properly till the sections that still needed clearing, how to set up a basic drip irrigation system using gravity feed from the collection barrels Vernon had brought by last week, how to build sturdy trellises that would last seasons instead of weeks. Arthur worked with the efficiency of someone who'd been farming his entire adult life, but he was patient with Bennett's questions, explaining things clearly and without condescension. As they worked, Arthur shared stories about farming, about the land, about his late wife who'd loved gardening almost as much as Eleanor had. She and Eleanor used to trade plants, Arthur said while they were setting posts for a bean trellis. They'd spend hours talking about soil amendments and companion planting and seed saving. I thought they were both a little crazy, to be honest. Seemed like too much fuss for vegetables. "What changed your mind?" Bennett asked. "After my wife died, I found her garden journal. Page after page of notes, observations, careful records of everything she'd grown. I realized it wasn't crazy. It was love. Love for the process, for the plants, for the connection to something larger than yourself." Arthur hammered a post into place with 3 solid strikes. "That's what you're doing here. Maybe you started because you needed something to do, but you've kept going because you love it. That's worth preserving. By midday, they'd accomplished more than Bennett had managed in the previous 2 weeks. The garden looked more organized, more intentional, more like something that would last beyond a single season. They took a break in the shade, drinking water from the thermos Arthur had brought. Scout sprawled between them, exhausted from supervising their work. "I've been thinking," Arthur said after a long silence. "That farmer's market in town opens first Saturday in May. That's 3 weeks from now. You've got enough growing here to sell. Not a lot, but enough to start." Bennett considered it. "You think people would buy vegetables from Eleanor's garden?" "I think they'd line up for them. Everyone over 50 in this town remembers her produce. They'd buy it just for the nostalgia, but they'd keep buying because it's good. Heirloom varieties taste better than the hybrid stuff in grocery stores. People know the difference. I don't know the first thing about selling at a market. Neither did Eleanor when she started. She figured it out." "So will you." Arthur stood, dusting off his pants. "Come on, we've got irrigation lines to run. And tomorrow we'll work on building proper cold frames for the seedlings. Vernon's bringing lumber." As they returned to work, Bennett felt something he'd been afraid to acknowledge, the possibility that this might actually work. Not just the garden, but the life he was building around it. A life that involved other people, shared purpose, mornings spent doing work that mattered. He'd lost his evening job, yes. His financial situation was still precarious, but he wasn't alone anymore. And somehow, that made everything seem less impossible. Scout barked once, chasing a butterfly through the rows of vegetables, and Bennett allowed himself to hope. The first Saturday of May arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine. Perfect weather for the farmer's market opening. Bennett had spent the previous evening harvesting, tomatoes still green but starting to blush red, early lettuce, bundles of herbs, the first zucchini. Arthur had helped him load everything into crates lined with damp towels to keep things fresh. "Don't underprice yourself," Arthur had advised. "People will pay fair value for quality. Eleanor never gave her work away cheap, and neither should you." Now Bennett stood behind a folding table borrowed from Constance, with Eleanor's old market sign that Mrs. Cordelia had provided propped against the front. The sign was hand-painted wood, weathered but still readable. Eleanor's garden, fresh heirloom vegetables. He'd worried no one would come, that he'd sit alone all morning with his modest offerings, while other vendors with their abundant displays attracted all the customers. But within the first hour, he understood how wrong he'd been. Older customers recognized the sign immediately. They'd stop, stare, approach with something like reverence. Eleanor's garden. A woman in her 70s touched the sign gently. "I thought that place died with her." "I'm bringing it back," Bennett explained, and found himself telling the story again and again. Finding the field, Scout discovering the wild plants, uncovering Eleanor's seeds and notes. People bought his vegetables and shared their memories. Eleanor bringing baskets to church. Eleanor leaving produce on doorsteps for families going through hard times. Eleanor's tomatoes that tasted like sunshine. Eleanor's kindness, her generosity, her belief that good food should be available to everyone. By noon, Bennett had sold nearly everything he'd brought and made $180. More money than he'd expected, but more importantly, he'd connected with dozens of people who cared about what he was doing, who wanted Eleanor's garden to continue, who saw value in preserving something that had mattered to their community. As he was packing up the few remaining items, an elderly woman approached, moving slowly with a cane. She studied his sign for a long moment before speaking. "You're the one restoring Eleanor's garden." Her voice was thin but clear. "Yes, ma'am. I bought the property a few months ago. Have you found Eleanor's special patch yet?" She asked it casually, but something in her tone suggested the question wasn't casual at all. Special patch? Bennett set down the crate he'd been loading. Eleanor kept her best crops separate, in a back section. Not many people knew about it. She was particular about who she told. The woman smiled slightly. "I'm Gertrude Lang. Eleanor and I were friends for 40 years. She mentioned that patch to me once, said it was where she kept the varieties she was most proud of." Said she hoped someone would find it someday and understand what she'd been protecting. Bennett's mind raced. He'd cleared nearly half the garden. Thought he'd explored most of the property. What had he missed? Do you know where it was? He asked. Back section, she said. Past the tree line. I never saw it myself. She was protective of it. But she mentioned it enough times that I knew it mattered to her. Gertrude patted his arm gently. If you haven't found it yet, maybe you should look. The drive home felt longer than usual, Gertrude's words circling in his mind. Back section, past the tree line. Bennett had focused all his work on the obvious garden space, the area where the rows were visible and the soil clearly showed signs of cultivation. He hadn't pushed past the dense growth at the back edge, where the property met the woods. At home, he pulled out the deed Mrs. Cordelia had given him. 5 acres, the document stated clearly. He'd never questioned it, never measured it, just accepted what he'd been told. But what if there was more? Sunday morning, Bennett and Arthur stood at the back edge of the garden, staring at the thick wall of brush and young trees that marked where the cleared land ended. You really think there's something back there? Arthur asked skeptically. Gertrude Lang seemed certain, and Eleanor's notes mentioned a preservation section, but I never found it in the main garden. Only one way to find out. They pushed through the overgrowth, Scout leading the way with his nose to the ground, tail wagging with the excitement of exploring new territory. Branches caught at their clothes, thorns scratched their arms, but they pressed forward. After about 50 yards, the dense growth opened suddenly into another clearing. Bennett stopped so abruptly that Arthur nearly ran into him. Lord have mercy, Arthur breathed. Before them lay a second garden space, smaller than the main one, but clearly deliberately created. The remains of a collapsed greenhouse structure stood at one end, its frame still intact, but glass panels long gone. Gold frames lined one side, some broken but others surprisingly intact. And everywhere, covering every available space, plants grew wild and tangled, but unmistakably cultivated. Berry bushes heavy with early fruit. Perennial herbs grown massive and woody. Small fruit trees that had been trained to espalier against frames, now leaning but still bearing. Raised beds built from stone, still holding their shape, filled with plants that looked different from anything Bennett had seen in the main garden. This is... Arthur paused, searching for words. This is extraordinary. They spent the next hour exploring, documenting what they found. Scout discovered more buried containers, similar to the one that had held Eleanor's seeds. Arthur identified plants, rare varieties he recognized from his own decades of farming. Heirloom herbs he'd thought were extinct in the region. These berry bushes alone, Arthur said. Examining a particularly healthy specimen, if you could propagate these, sell the starts, you could make good money. These are heritage varieties people spend years trying to find. But the most stunning discovery came when Vernon arrived, Bennett had called him immediately, and began examining the plants more closely. Do you know what these are? Vernon's voice shook as he pointed to a section of raised beds. These are Eleanor's seed mother plants, the ones she saved seeds from year after year. Some of these varieties, Bennett, some of these haven't been available commercially in 30 years. She was preserving them, keeping them alive. Vernon pulled out his phone and started taking photographs, his hands trembling. We need to document all of this. We need to contact the Agricultural Extension Office, maybe the university. This isn't just a garden. This is a genetic library. This is agricultural heritage. Bennett felt overwhelmed. He'd thought he understood what he'd found when he discovered Eleanor's seed tin. But this was something far larger. There's something else, Arthur said quietly. He was standing at the far edge of the clearing, examining a metal post driven into the ground. This is a survey marker, a real one, professionally placed. He looked back at Bennett. This clearing is still on your property, which means your land is bigger than 5 acres. They called Mrs. Cordelia immediately. She arrived within the hour, bringing the original property documents her family had kept. As they spread the papers across the hood of Bennett's truck, the truth became clear. The property wasn't 5 acres. It was 10. The back 5 acres had been hidden by growth so thick that previous surveys had missed them entirely. Eleanor's preservation garden occupied roughly 2 of those back acres. "My God," Mrs. Cordelia whispered, seeing the garden for the first time. "Mother Eleanor's sanctuary. That's what she called it. I'd forgotten. I was just a young woman when she was still working this land. She told me once she had a place where she kept things safe, but I never knew what she meant." Vernon was still photographing plants, making notes, his excitement palpable. "Bennett, do you understand what this means?" Eleanor was doing conservation work decades before anyone recognized its importance. She was saving varieties that corporations were trying to eliminate, protecting biodiversity before it became a movement. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" Bennett asked, feeling the weight of it pressing down on him. "Protect it," Vernon said simply. "Continue what she started. These plants, these seeds, they represent generations of careful selection, of preserving what's best. You can't let them disappear." As the sun set that evening, Bennett sat in Eleanor's preservation garden, Scout beside him, trying to process everything. He'd bought this land hoping for quiet, for space to breathe, for something to give his life purpose. Instead, he'd inherited a legacy that felt impossibly large. He thought about Eleanor working this land into her 80s, carefully preserving seeds, protecting varieties she thought might disappear. Working alone, telling few people, trusting that someday someone would find what she'd built and understand its value. She'd been waiting for him. For someone who would care enough to look deeper, to push past the obvious, to see what others had missed. He was that person now, whether he felt ready for it or not. The responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, as Scout leaned against his leg and the last light faded from the sky, Bennett felt something else entirely. Purpose, not just personal healing, not just a way to fill his days, but genuine purpose. He was the keeper of something that mattered beyond himself, beyond his lifetime. He couldn't walk away from this. Wouldn't. Whatever it took, he would protect what Eleanor had built. Word about the discovery spread faster than Bennett expected. Vernon contacted colleagues at the State Agricultural University, and within a week, Dr. Patricia Brennan, a professor specializing in heirloom crop preservation, drove 3 hours to see Eleanor's sanctuary garden for herself. She walked the space in reverent silence, occasionally kneeling to examine plants more closely, taking photographs, making notes in a small field book. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of professional excitement barely contained. "Mr. Bennett, some of these varieties are thought to be extinct. We have them listed in historical records, but no living specimens. If we can propagate from these plants, save their seeds properly, we could reintroduce them to cultivation." She looked at him seriously. "This is significant. This is the kind of discovery that changes how we think about crop preservation." "What do I need to do?" Bennett asked. "First, let us document everything properly. I'd like to bring a team, graduate students, a botanist, an agricultural historian. We'll catalog every plant, take samples, create a complete record. Then we'll help you develop a preservation plan. With your permission, of course. This is your land, your decision." Bennett thought about Eleanor's wariness, the way she'd hidden this garden, protected it from institutions and corporations. But Dr. Brennan's approach felt different, respectful, collaborative, genuinely interested in preservation rather than exploitation. "What about ownership?" Bennett asked. "If I let you document everything, do I maintain control?" "Absolutely. We'd propose a partnership. The university provides expertise, resources, maybe some funding for proper infrastructure. You retain complete ownership and final say on all decisions. We just want to help ensure this genetic material survives." Vernon vouched for Dr. Brennan, had worked with her on previous projects. "She's one of the good ones. Cares about the right things." Bennett agreed, and within 2 weeks the university team arrived. 5 people with specialized equipment, notebooks, cameras, soil testing kits. They treated Eleanor's garden with the reverence Bennett had hoped for, moving carefully through the space, speaking in hushed tones as if in a cathedral. They found Eleanor's preservation ledger in a waterproof container buried near the greenhouse ruins, a detailed record of every variety she'd maintained, where she'd obtained each one, why it mattered, how to grow it successfully. The final entry, dated April 1985, read, "If I die before finding someone to carry this forward, I pray the land protects what I cannot." Bennett read those words 3 times, feeling the full weight of Eleanor's faith. She trusted that her work would outlive her, that someone would eventually recognize what she'd built. The team's documentation took a week. When they finished, Dr. Brennan sat with Bennett at his kitchen table, spreading photographs and reports across the surface. "We've identified 43 distinct varieties in the preservation garden," she said. 17 of them we thought were extinct. The genetic value alone is extraordinary. But more than that, the way Eleanor selected and maintained these plants shows sophisticated understanding of genetics and biodiversity. She was doing cutting-edge preservation work 40 years ago. "What happens now?" Bennett asked. "That's up to you. But I'd recommend applying for a heritage preservation grant. There's funding available for exactly this kind of project, protecting agricultural genetic resources. The money could help you build proper infrastructure, hire help, make this sustainable long-term." The grant application took 2 weeks to complete, with Dr. Brennan guiding Bennett through the process. He described Eleanor's work, his own discovery, the garden's significance. He outlined plans for restoration, education, community involvement. He made the case for why this small plot of land mattered in the larger conversation about food security and biodiversity. While waiting for the grant decision, life at the garden continued. Arthur had essentially become a partner in the operation, showing up most mornings to help with heavy work. Vernon came regularly, teaching Bennett proper seed-saving techniques. Constance organized volunteer days, and a dozen community members would arrive to help with weeding, harvesting, whatever needed doing. The farmers' market had become a weekly ritual. Bennett's table was always busy now, people seeking out Eleanor's vegetables specifically. The income wasn't substantial, but it covered basics and proved the garden could be financially viable with proper management. Then Sterling Reeves appeared. He arrived at the property on a Tuesday afternoon in an expensive car, wearing clothes too clean for farmland. Mid-40s, confident, with the smooth manner of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Sterling Reeves with Heartland Development. I wanted to talk to you about your property." Bennett set down the hoe he'd been using. "I'm not interested in selling. Hear me out. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for these 10 acres. I understand you're doing heritage preservation work here, and I respect that. My company would maintain the agricultural character, create a heritage farm park. Educational, community-focused. Your garden's legacy would be preserved, but professionally managed. $50,000. Bennett's mind reeled. That was life-changing money. That would pay off every debt, give him security, solve every financial worry he had. "I need to think about it," Bennett said carefully. "Of course. But don't take too long. These opportunities don't wait forever." Reeves handed him a business card and drove away, leaving Bennett standing in Eleanor's garden, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. That evening, he researched Heartland Development. What he found made his stomach tighten. Sterling Reeves specialized in acquiring properties under the guise of preservation, then developing them commercially once public attention moved on. Heritage Farm Park likely meant tourist attraction, gift shop, parking lot. Eleanor's garden would become a commodity, her work repackaged and sold. When Vernon stopped by the next morning, Bennett told him about the offer. "You sell to him. Everything Eleanor built dies," Vernon said flatly. "He'll take photographs, make promises, then build whatever makes him the most money." "I've seen his type before." Bennett already knew he couldn't sell. Not to Reeves, not to anyone who wouldn't honor what this place truly was. But turning down $50,000 when he could barely make rent felt like choosing poverty. "The grant," Arthur said when they discussed it. "You need that grant. It's your only chance at making this sustainable without selling out." The grant committee site visit was scheduled for the following week. Everything depended on it. The morning of the grant committee visit, Bennett woke to the sound of rain hammering against his window. He checked his phone. 4:30 in the morning, and the weather forecast showed storms continuing until noon. The committee was scheduled to arrive at 10. He drove to the property through sheets of water, windshield wipers working frantically. Scout huddled in the passenger seat, equally miserable. What Bennett found when he arrived made his heart sink. The storm had damaged sections of fencing he'd repaired weeks ago. Water pooled in low areas of the garden, threatening to drown young plants. Worse, part of the makeshift cover he'd constructed over the preservation garden's cold frames had collapsed, exposing delicate seedlings to the driving rain. He stood in the downpour, trying not to despair. The committee would be here in 5 hours, and the garden looked like a disaster. His phone rang. "Arthur." "How bad is it?" Arthur asked without preamble. "Bad. Fencing down, flooding in the low sections, cold frame cover collapsed. I'm on my way. Called Vernon and Constance. We'll get it fixed." Within 40 minutes they all arrived. Arthur with tools and stakes, Vernon with tarps and rope, Constance with a dozen other volunteers from town. People who'd helped on previous weekends, who'd bought vegetables at the farmer's market, who believed in what Bennett was doing. They worked in the rain without complaint. Arthur and 3 others repaired fencing. Vernon's group secured the cold frame covers. Constance led the drainage team, digging channels to redirect water away from vulnerable plants. Bennett moved between groups, overwhelmed by the coordinated effort, by this community that had somehow formed around Eleanor's garden. By 9 o'clock, the rain had slowed to drizzle. By 9:30, it stopped completely. The sun broke through clouds, and steam rose from the wet earth. The garden looked rough but functional. The damage was repaired. Plants that could be saved had been saved. "Go clean up," Arthur told Bennett. "You've got 20 minutes before they arrive. We'll stay and make sure everything looks right." Bennett drove home, changed into dry clothes, returned to find Arthur had organized the volunteer crew into a final cleanup effort. Debris cleared, tools put away. The garden as presentable as possible given the morning's chaos. The committee arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, 3 people in a university van. The program director, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Helen Crawford, led the group. She stepped out of the van, surveyed the wet garden, and smiled. "Looks like you had an interesting morning. We had some storm damage," Bennett admitted. "But we got it sorted out, we?" Dr. Crawford looked around at the volunteers still present. "I couldn't do this alone," Bennett said simply. "This garden, it's become a community project." Dr. Crawford's smile widened. "Show us what you've built." Bennett gave them the tour, starting with the main garden. He showed them the rows of heirloom vegetables, explained Eleanor's original layout, demonstrated the irrigation system Vernon had helped construct. He shared stories about finding Scout's discovery, about clearing the land one section at a time, about learning as he went. Arthur joined them, providing technical details about soil restoration, crop rotation, sustainable practices Bennett had implemented. His expertise lent credibility Bennett alone couldn't have provided. They moved to the preservation garden, and the committee's demeanor shifted from interested to genuinely impressed. Dr. Brennan had sent ahead her documentation, but seeing the plants in person was different. "These are remarkable," Dr. Crawford said, examining the heritage tomato varieties. "The genetic diversity here, this isn't just historically interesting, it's practically valuable." Vernon stepped forward, explaining the seed-saving protocols Bennett had learned, the careful documentation they'd established, the plans for propagating rare varieties. The committee asked hard questions. Could Bennett sustain this long-term? What happened if he couldn't continue? How would he ensure the preservation work continued beyond his lifetime? Vernon answered before Bennett could. "I've committed to co-managing this operation, teaching Bennett commercial seed saving, helping establish protocols that will outlast both of us." Arthur added, "I've pledged ongoing support for infrastructure maintenance and technical assistance. This isn't one person's project anymore." Constance presented a folder of documentation, volunteer sign-up lists, community interest in educational programs, letters from residents expressing support. The committee witnessed something Bennett hadn't fully recognized himself, This garden had become larger than him. It had sparked something in the community, created connections, given people a shared purpose. Dr. Crawford's final question was direct. What would you do if you don't receive this grant? Bennett paused, considering his answer carefully. He thought about the $50,000 offer from Sterling Reeves, about the practical choice that would solve all his financial problems. He thought about the exhaustion, the struggle, the uncertainty. Then he thought about Eleanor's ledger, about her faith that someone would continue her work, about Arthur's friendship, Vernon's teaching, Constance's support, about the volunteers who'd shown up in the rain this morning without being asked. I'd continue anyway, Bennett said finally. I didn't find this garden to give up on it. The grant would help tremendously, but with or without it, I'm committed to protecting what Eleanor built. Dr. Crawford nodded slowly, making notes. We'll be in touch within 2 weeks. They left, and Bennett stood in the damp garden, surrounded by people who'd become friends, looking at what they'd all created together. You did good, Arthur said quietly. Bennett hoped it was enough. The envelope arrived on the 11th day. Bennett stared at it for a full minute before opening it, Scout sitting patiently beside him. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. We are pleased to inform you that your application for the Heritage Agricultural Preservation Grant has been approved. $25,000 for the first year, renewable annually based on documented progress. Additional support from the university's Agricultural Extension Program. Partnership opportunities for research and education. Bennett read it 3 times to be certain. Then he called Arthur, then Vernon, then Constance. Within an hour, they'd gathered at the garden, passing the letter around, reading the terms, beginning to understand what this meant. They celebrated with coffee from thermoses and sandwiches Constance had brought, sitting in the garden they'd all worked to restore. Proper greenhouse, Vernon said, his voice thick with emotion. We can restore Eleanor's structure the right way now. Educational programming, Constance added. Workshops on seed saving, heritage gardening. We could reach hundreds of people. Arthur was quieter, but Bennett saw the relief in his weathered face. This means you can do it right. No more scraping by, no more makeshift solutions. You can build something that lasts. The sound of an approaching car interrupted their celebration. Sterling Reeves emerged, carrying a leather folder, his expression confident. Mr. Bennett, I heard congratulations are in order. The grant approval is impressive. His smile was practiced, which is why I wanted to follow up on my offer. I'm prepared to increase it to $60,000, given the documented value of what you've established here. Bennett stood slowly, setting down his coffee. I already told you, I'm not selling. Be reasonable. $60,000 plus the grant money. You could secure your future. Let professionals manage this properly. It is being managed properly, Arthur said, standing beside Bennett. By people who understand what it actually is. Reeves's expression hardened. I was hoping we could handle this amicably. But I should inform you, I've commissioned my own property survey. There appear to be some discrepancies in the boundary lines. Specifically, the back 5 acres may actually encroach on adjacent property that my company recently acquired. Bennett felt ice in his stomach. That's not possible. The deed is clear. Deeds can be wrong. Surveys from the 1940s weren't always accurate. My survey suggests that your preservation garden, the valuable part of your property, may actually be partially on land I own. Reeves pulled documents from his folder. I'm prepared to be generous. Sell me the whole property at my offer price, or face lengthy legal proceedings to determine actual boundaries. Either way, you'll spend the grant money on lawyers instead of your garden. Vernon stepped forward, examining the documents carefully. These are recent surveys. Where are the originals from 1947? Obviously outdated given modern measurement technology, or obviously accurate, and your survey is deliberately fraudulent to create leverage. Vernon's voice was sharp with anger. I know surveyors in this county. I can have these documents checked by experts. Reeves's smile never faltered. Do what you need to, but understand litigation takes time, years potentially. Your grant has deadlines, requirements. Can you meet them while defending your property lines in court? He left them standing in shocked silence. Constance was the first to speak. Mrs. Cordelia. She has the original family documents, the 1947 survey. If we can prove those were accurate, Reeves's claim falls apart. They called immediately. Cordelia promised to search her attic to find everything related to the property's history. The next morning, they gathered in Cordelia's living room. She'd spent the entire night searching and had spread dozens of yellowed papers across her dining table. The original property survey, dated 1947, authenticated by the county clerk, showed all 10 acres clearly within the property boundaries Eleanor had farmed. "There's more," Cordelia said, her voice shaking with rage. "I found correspondence between my husband's family and the county surveyor who did the original work. He was meticulous, took pride in his accuracy. These measurements were triple-checked. Vernon's lawyer friend Lionel Gray arrived and examined everything with a professional eye. This is solid. More than solid, it's irrefutable. And I did some research on Reeves's surveyor. The man has a history of conveniently finding discrepancies that benefit Reeves's developments. Lionel filed counterclaims immediately, attaching the authenticated historical documents and expert testimony from descendants of the original surveyor. The hearing was scheduled within 2 weeks. When the day came, the courtroom filled with supporters. Arthur, Vernon, Constance, Mrs. Cordelia, Dr. Brennan from the university, and dozens of community members who'd worked in the garden or bought vegetables at the market. Reeves arrived with an expensive lawyer, confident and polished. But confidence crumbled under the weight of evidence. The original survey was clear, authenticated, and professionally executed. Aerial photographs from the 1950s confirmed the boundaries. Expert testimony demolished the credibility of Reeves's surveyor. The judge ruled decisively in Bennett's favor, validated the original property lines, and ordered Reeves to pay all of Bennett's legal fees. Additionally, the judge issued a warning about filing fraudulent boundary claims. On the courthouse steps, surrounded by friends and neighbors, Bennett felt the weight of months of anxiety finally lift. The garden was protected. Eleanor's legacy was secure. Dr. Brennan had waited for the verdict before sharing her own news. The university wants to establish a permanent research station at Eleanor's garden. We're prepared to offer you a position as Heritage Garden Director and Educator. It's not a large salary, but it would be steady, allow you to focus on the garden full-time. Bennett accepted without hesitation. Weeks later, greenhouse restoration began following Eleanor's original blueprints. Volunteers, some familiar faces, many new, worked together, building something that would last generations. The grand opening drew hundreds of people. Older residents shared Eleanor's stories. Younger people learned about seed preservation. The garden had become what Eleanor had always wanted, a place of learning, sharing, and connection. Bennett taught his first workshop with Arthur co-teaching beside him. 2 widowers who'd found friendship in shared purpose. Constance established a seed-lending library where people could borrow seeds, grow them, save seeds, and return them to share with others. Mrs. Cordelia attended every event, finally at peace, knowing her mother-in-law's life work was honored and continuing. The garden produced abundantly now, enough to sell at market and donate weekly to the local food bank, continuing Eleanor's tradition of feeding those in need. One evening, Bennett walked the garden alone with Scout, surveying everything they'd built together. He stood where Scout had first dug and found those wild tomato plants, now marked with a commemorative plaque that read, "Eleanor's Garden, where what was lost is found again." He placed his hand on the plaque, feeling the full weight of gratitude and responsibility. Margaret's garden journal now rested in a display case at the garden's entrance, honored alongside Eleanor's ledger. 2 women who'd loved growing things, both teaching him from beyond, both showing him that life persisted if you gave it space and care. He wasn't the same broken man who'd bought this field for $100, desperate and alone. Community had grown around him like the plants in Eleanor's rows, organically, naturally, each person finding their place in the larger design. Scout suddenly became alert at the edge of a new section. Tail wagging, ready to dig, Bennett laughed. calling him back. "Not today, boy. I think we've found enough for now," but he made a mental note to check that spot tomorrow. The land had taught him it kept giving if you tended it with respect and attention. He'd learned that legacy wasn't about ownership. It was about stewardship for the next generation. He no longer worried about what he'd leave behind. This garden was his legacy. Not just the plants, but the community. The preserved seeds, the knowledge shared, the connections forged. Bennett walked toward the small cabin that had been built at the garden's edge. His new home, closer to his work, simpler and richer than anything he'd had before. Light glowed warm in the windows. Soup simmered on the stove, made from vegetables he'd grown himself. He paused at the doorway, looking back over both garden sections in the gathering twilight. Everything growing in neat rows, strong and healthy. Evidence of care and commitment and the patient work of many hands. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered into the evening air. "Thank you, Margaret." "Thank you, Scout." Gratitude too large for any words he could find. He stepped inside, Scout following close behind, and closed the door softly on a perfect evening. The $100 bill hung framed on his wall, a reminder of the best investment he'd ever made. Not in land, but in hope. In believing something forgotten could still be saved. Outside, Eleanor's garden thrived under the emerging stars, alive with possibility, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring.